For those of you who don't know me, I am Natalie Summersinger. I am the Executive Director of UNA UK, but I am on sabbatical in New York, working on the campaign to mark the UN's 75th anniversary next year. I was pretty torn about moving away from the UK at this turbulent time for the country, when it feels like all of us who have an international outlook, whose vision for Britain is one of global leadership in peace, sustainable development and human rights, but also of humility and honesty about our own challenges, our past and role in the world, as a force for immense good, which we have been, but also as the cause of immense suffering. I think all of us need to be here and to make our voices heard. Because despite of our political fault lines, I firmly believe that there is a clear majority in this country for far-sighted and principled leadership, for human rights, for kinder, more compassionate politics, and also for a global Britain whose power and influence comes from its contribution to a safer, fairer, and more sustainable world. Ladies and gentlemen, at long last brings me to the 2019 recipient of the Sir Brian Urquhart Award, Andrew Gilmour.
Thank you for those extraordinarily kind words, Natalie. Last weekend, my wife and I were staying up in upstate Massachusetts with an elderly and much-loved couple. And the man said over breakfast, what are you doing this week? And I said, actually going to London. Blighty, what are you going to do there? And actually going to get a prize. Good, what sort of prize? And I said, well, Brian, for it was actually the great man himself, I said, it's a prize, it's actually called the Sir Brian Urquhart Award. Look of utter bafflement. Hearing aids adjusted. What the hell did they do that for? I looked slightly offended. I said, well, I think they were being nice. He said, no. Why would they call it that? Are you sure? What the devil were they thinking? And I said, well, I don't really know where to start, Brian, but I think they think you're a good chap, basically. And I do feel that little exchange does illustrate one not so well known, one of his many great qualities, which is his innate modesty, his genuine disbelief that people would be wanting to honor him, and in his 100th year. And yet those achievements are massive, and many of them, like joining the British Army on the first day the war was declared, the young intelligence officer, very accurately depicted in the film A Bridge Too Far, speaking truth to power, bravely telling his senior officers that it was a catastrophically bad idea to proceed with the drop of paratroopers into Arnhem and other places, even that there were hugely reinforced panzer divisions waiting for them. The first Allied officer to enter and liberate the hell that was the Belsen death camp. And the list goes on, as Natalie said, joining the UN, the second staff member in 1945. It is a spectacularly distinguished career for 4 decades. And I would say that probably actually no other, in its 75-year history, no other UN career official has anything like that distinction and reputation. And perhaps if I had to explain in one word, in one sentence, what it is about him, I would say it was the combination, which I've never seen equaled in anybody living or dead, somebody who combined the ethics, values, and ideals, and at the same time, such as an understanding of the practical, gritty realities, the murky deals, the endless constraints that prevent ideals being put into practice. Because not only did he play such a role in the UN's history, he's also the greatest historian of the organization. His trilogy of books and a plethora of articles, all to come together into an oeuvre that is literally unsurpassed in the history of the organization. So I'm often asked, how has it changed in the 33 years since Brian left the organization, which more or less coincides with the 30 years that I joined, which was within a week of the fall of the Berlin Wall, which, of course, ushered in the end of the Cold War. And there, in some ways, you have it, because the whole of Brian's career was spanned by the Cold War, a time where it led to a number of proxy, vicious, hot wars. And yet at the same time, the institution, the Security Council, that was designed precisely to prevent wars and to bring them to an end, was paralyzed by those Cold War divisions and prevented from taking action. What I would say was the best thing that happened in that time, since he left and I joined, would be probably in his area of peacekeeping. That he was the guy that set up, played a major role in setting up peacekeeping operations, and how they've developed from in those days, just quietly getting on and doing their patrolling of border zones and local confidence building measures into something that's far more encompassing nation building, development, political and human rights, but also protecting civilians. That's a big, big change. And to give one example, in December 2013, a decision was taken that I'm proud to have played a small part in, to open the gates in what was then, and is still, the newest country on earth, South Sudan, which was descending into carnage. And the decision was taken to open the gates to allow people to flee from that carnage and to take refuge. That had never been done before, and it hasn't actually been done since either, but it is indicative of a trend to allow people to, and I don't believe any decisions actually led to the direct saving of more lives than that one, but as a positive trend, it's hard to beat that one in my view. On the downside, there is the global trend at the moment, and I'll give a rather truncated version of what I was going to say in this regard. We do see a backlash against human rights. I joined, in my O-level year, I joined Amnesty International, obviously having no idea that the world was on the cusp of a human rights revolution that was going to last several decades, but has, alas, grinding come to a halt. And we now see a pushback on so many aspects of human rights. We see a series of interlocking crises, of civil society being squeezed in so many places. We see the rise of populist, authoritarian nationalists, always looking for victims to target and to blame, and a pushback on rule of law and human rights. We see the environmental crisis. We see continuation of horribly violent wars in Yemen, Libya, Syria, South Sudan, Congo, the Rohingya, the mass expulsion and mass rape of people, and very little prospect of that ethnic cleansing being reversed. We see in Palestine, the unremitting, unending, unconscionable, ever-deepening occupation of the West Bank and the siege of Gaza. And yet, at a time of all these pushbacks, it would seem so obvious. It would be the absolute no-brainer, the plains of Pikestaff, ça va sans dire, whatever, blindingly bloody obvious, that what the world needs is to strengthen international institutions at a time where no one country or group of countries can actually manage to resolve those issues. And yet at this time, on top of all the pushback against democracy, truth by politicians, particularly relevant in this country, the pushback against rights and everything else, we see another crisis, that of multilateralism. So instead of actually countries coming together and working in concert to resolve these issues, what we actually see is a weakening of institutions. We see leading countries pulling out of organizations. We see the besmirching of their reputation. We see the cutting of funding. We're currently going through the biggest financial crisis in the history of the UN, and in a sort of rather mark of bathos, I would say, we've seen this week the cutting off of drinking water to delegates in interminable UN meetings. But I mean, that's how bad it becomes. Instead of actually reinforcing international organizations, we seem to be weakening them just at this time. And there's also this issue which brings me back to Brian, because it was his 100th birthday this year, and in a lovely event hosted by the British Member Representative, Karen Pierce, a message was read out by the Secretary General, which described Brian as the symbol of what makes the international civil service: principled, dedicated, impartial. And he said that Brian's book, his memoirs, should be required reading for anybody working at the UN. But I wish it was required reading, because I don't see nearly enough evidence of the fact that that impartial, dedicated civil service is still thriving as much as it should be. And that's particularly ironic in a way, because it's not only Brian's 100th birthday this year, it's also the centennial of the international civil service, set up very much on British lines under the first Secretary General of the League of Nations, Sir Eric Drummond. And yet we see this pushback, which I hope UNA, and I believe they are, because they've kindly asked me to be part of an initiative next year, and I'll have left the UN by then, so in a freer position to talk about it, how we need to push back for that. UK's influence, clearly nothing like what it was when Urquhart joined in 1945, and frankly rather less than it was when he left in 1986. Structural reasons, of course, the rise of Asia, the decline of Europe as a whole, but we cannot deny that current events in this country are contributing to that loss of influence. I would say that it's been 3.5 years since David Cameron, bless him, gave us that referendum, but I have not met one diplomat or foreign official in 3.5 years who does not believe, insofar as he or she has told me, that Britain has not shot herself in the foot and done a huge act of self-harm. And there is only one distinction. It's a consensus view. I've not met one who doesn't believe in that. The only difference is that those countries that don't like Britain and actually want its influence to decline are very happy about it. Schadenfreude is a German word, but it's absolutely not a German sentiment, at least on this issue. The true friends of Britain are mortified by the dishonesty, the cowardice, and the incompetence of our politicians, and how the reputation of what was a once respected nation is in such dramatic decline, and the loss of its influence. And related to that, I would say, and it grieves me tremendously to say this, is that there's a fear in the human rights movement that Britain's commitment to human rights is going to decline as a result. We know, we've all been told, in my view, entirely inaccurately, that it's going to be a piece of cake to negotiate hundreds of bilateral trade deals, including with countries that have very spotty human rights records. But actually, the fear is that in the mad rush to make such deals, British negotiators will drop all environmental, social, human rights and labour safeguards. And I would hope that maybe UNA could try to keep UN values on that to make sure that negotiators are not allowed just to jettison the finer traditions of UK support for human rights. So I just want to, the same day that I told Brian about this evening, he said to me a few hours later, describing UNA UK as a small group of people. It's he said, a terrific example of a small group of people just quietly getting on with it, doing things for a nobler, better purpose, and just frankly doing it more effectively than anybody else. Now I remember those words exactly, and I share the sentiment very much. So on behalf of many UN colleagues that have been decades in perilous countries working, particularly those who share those UN ideals which Brian Urquhart fought so valiantly for, and I'm thinking particularly of my colleagues in human rights, it really is a massive honour to be associated with him through this prize, and with you, Natalie, and UNA UK. Thank you so much.